Thank you very much. I'll invite my panelists up onto the stage. It is a privilege to be here, if only because I get to express some of the frustration that I feel as a journalist who is used to covering conflict in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, where you have to deal with the problem because it's happening right in front of you. Whereas in the cyber world, I feel like I've spent the past decade or so often listening to people admiring the problem without coming up with concrete solutions. And I thought maybe that's just me. Maybe I've come at this from a specific bias. And then I heard over the past couple of days, former Estonian President Ilves talking about his frustrations that NATO, the EU, the UN, from his perspective, haven't come up with concrete policies to defend against cyber attacks, especially in the cyber InfoWars realm. And then General Robert Neller, the Marine Corps general that spoke to us, I spoke to him afterwards and he agreed to let me share these comments. I said, what is it going to take to get some rules of the road for when you can strike back and how? And he said, disaster. And he said, look, my Marines, I need to be able to tell them in black and white when they're allowed to fight, and I feel like in the cyber world I'm stuck in shades of gray. So with that, I'm going to turn to my panel. I have warned them that we're going to start with some real-world questions. Let me introduce them. We have Mr. Rod Beckstrom, founder and CEO of Beckstrom Inc., and the former president and CEO of ICANN. Mr. Kjørn Giesbergs, the former general manager of NATO Communications and Information Agency, now at the University of Oxford. And Ambassador Søren Dukaru, the former assistant secretary general for NATO's emerging security challenges, and now at the Hudson Institute and a special advisor at the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. That means that you all have held senior positions where you discussed many of these problems, but probably couldn't talk about it much in public. But you're your own men now, so I expect some blunt pronouncements. Let's start with a lightning round. If Russia takes down Estonia's electric grid and deaths result, say from traffic lights working erratically or the ICU unit in a hospital losing power, what should NATO, Europe, and the world do? What should their response be?
Well, frankly, there are a couple of things that come to mind. There's immediate action that has to do with providing enhanced situational awareness. One of the things that NATO was able to do, for example, was to prove that non-country alone can be as well informed as smart, have the situational awareness that a whole alliance has. So I would say that Estonia would benefit from the communication with NATO's Computer Incidents Response Center that actually Kun was running when he was on the job, but also with the cyber threat assessment set that has also feeds not just with the country, but also with NATO's partners and with industry. There would be a lot of potentially action focused on, again, awareness, mitigation, also beyond the cyber domain, like helping with everything from extra battery power capacity to emergency response of all sorts. But then the big response, the political response and so on, will depend on a couple of things. And the most important, I would say, would be context and impact of the whole cyber attack. Frankly, this is not, I would say, the most complex cyber attack. When I say context, I mean, is this happening in the context of a, whatever, military exercise around Estonia, like Zapad last year? Is this linked with other attacks in other places? What is the impact, the toll in terms of loss of human life, property? how persistent is it? I mean, is it taking long, or are systems easily recovered? So all this will determine the kind of response, and usually there is this platform of political consultations. They could be on an ad hoc basis, they could be under Article 4. I don't see, I mean, if this is in a much more complex scenario with really huge casualties, there could be the question, is it coming close to the threshold of armed attack or not? So I would say that there are a couple of instruments linked also in relationship with what other organizations do, European Union. There's a confidence building measure process and communication process within the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So again, it depends. I would say that such a scenario in Estonia, which is a country that after it went through so many things after 2007, after all these exercises that were mentioned, they will be very much prepared to handle a lot on their own. The aspects of if this is linked with something much bigger, like potential military operation, then in the case of NATO, crisis response measures that would mean like even sending NATO's rapid reaction force. SACEUR could think about triggering it's called counter-surprise measures. But again, it needs to be a more complex scenario in a wider context to really trigger a NATO response that goes beyond just mitigation, help, restore system, which is reflex. I mean, this is done on a daily basis.
And it would be up to Estonia to make the case.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Your go.
My cut. So first off is clearly I would hope that the members of NATO, that the appropriate articles would be invoked and the appropriate other members of the alliance would be defending and taking action here in Estonia, both in terms of cyber responses and kinetically, if necessary. So, and I think, you know, we have to get to this point of defining what is an act of war. In my view, if you engage in cyber offense and that leads to deaths of human beings, that very clearly is potentially an act of war. But I know there's very serious implications of invoking that status, and I leave that to the military experts and legal.
Though again, what if it wasn't intentional?
Oh, if it's not intentional, then no.
How do you prove that?
Right, that's a lot tougher. But I actually want to talk about the problem and what we can do to solve it, because, you know, first let me give it big picture context here quickly. First is the largest cyber crisis I've had to deal with was that there's only been one attack that threatened to take down the global internet, and that was Operation Global Blackout that was announced on February 12th of 2012, and I was the CEO of ICANN at the time. And the threat was to take down the global internet on March 31st of 2012 by bringing down the domain name system, by attacking all the root servers globally. And initially we thought that was perhaps a hoax and was not genuine, and then unfortunately we learned from our friends in intelligence circles around the world pretty quickly that that was a serious potential attack that was under development. And it was a fascinating work effort together globally over 8 weeks with unbelievable collaboration from nation states, corporations, all over the planet. But I want to come back to the grid. So I'm familiar with the concept of huge outages. And in my view, the single greatest risk in cyber that every country in the world has is taking grids out. And I believe that today, every single nation in the world is entirely vulnerable in terms of their grid being attacked. And so what I'm going to say is, in big context, I have a law of cybersecurity. It's called Beckstrom's Law of Cybersecurity. It's not the one you'll find on the internet. On Wikipedia, that's Beckstrom's Law that relates to the economics of cybersecurity and networks. But I have Beckstrom's Law of Cybersecurity, which is only 12 words. Anything networked can be hacked. Everything is being networked. Everything is vulnerable. And that's the baseline of where we're going in society. And I want to talk about the grid real quickly, because it's so critical, because if the grid goes down in a significant fashion, whether for a nation state or for a military operation, it's absolutely disastrous. Would be like the internet going down, which is a lot harder to bring the internet down than a grid down. But so there's actually something we can do. And I'm actually really pleased there's a lot of smart young people in the room, because you're the ones that can help drive this revolution. But what could we do? What if I said we could enhance the resilience of the grid 10 or 100-fold within 10 years by only increasing our investment in the grid by 1%. Now, how can we do that? What could be done? And there's two concepts I have here. And the first is the primary one that I hope that we can discuss and debate and maybe even really dig into next year here, or maybe a country will begin to move. And the solution here is one that the forest people of Estonia would respect. And the forest people were the people that defended this country or resisted the occupation and moved out into the woods and kind of ran guerrilla warfare for quite a prolonged period and risked their lives, but helped to slow the occupation of Estonia. So what would help the forest people of Estonia and what would help the people of the world? And that is, if you look at Beckham's law, everything is vulnerable. The next thing I want to say is that I'm going to argue that every grid in the world is indefensible. Now, you have to defend it, and you have to approve defenses. But if a determined nation state wants to take down your grid, I don't believe any country has a grid that's invulnerable, number one. Number two, I don't believe any cyber superpower is not developing the capabilities or already staged to take those kind of actions with their adversaries. And so if you assume that context, what can you do? Well, you don't give up. There's actually something we can do. And the technology curves are all pushing in the right direction. And that is, we have to decentralize the grid, shatter it massively. And nation states are already investing in most of this equation, but not the last piece. So an example is I have a beach house in Santa Cruz, California. I've got 39 solar panels on it. I generate 100% of my power by electrical, even for my car, for my Tesla. But I'm not switched off the grid yet, and I haven't added the technology to switch off the grid, but I need to. But the United States government subsidized my panels. The state of California subsidized my panels. I would have bought them anyway. But they didn't. They should have said, and when I got the first subsidy, it said I had to agree I would never shut them off the grid. I had to represent that because they wanted me to generate power during the peak load to power the air conditioners in Central Valley of California. The law should say exactly the opposite. You should only receive the subsidies for solar or alternative if you can switch off the grid. Because if you imagine, and I heard a statistic yesterday that 2/3 of the power generation in the world that's growing every year is renewable now, 2/3 of what's coming online. If just that 2/3 was being implemented in a way that could be taken off the grid, and we built the intelligence in the system. So what does it mean to be off the grid? Number one, it has to be able to be switchable off the grid if it's not existing air-gapped off the grid. Secondly, to be resilient, it needs to not be connected to the internet. So my panels, I could have them plugged into the internet and watch exactly how they generate power during the day. I've unplugged them. Because I don't want any visitors going into my microcontrollers on my panels. I can see my electrical bill every month and see that I have zero. My bill is zero. I pay for a $12 Grid Connect charge. But so let's just take this forward. If you look globally, we're subsidizing in most countries solar, particularly here in Europe, and wind and geothermal, et cetera. Whether we do these microgrids at the house level or the company level or the community level or a block level, if we decentralize the grid, it becomes incredibly resilient. And we don't have to do 100%. We can start with 1% and move to 5 and 10. But these evolutions of infrastructure move over 5, 10, 20 years. I think that we can do it. Now, the second idea is highly provocative related to what we can do to protect the grid. And there's a lot of brilliant policy wonks and strategists in the room. And I throw this one out as a thought exercise. And that is, if you assume there's three major cyber powers in the world today, and if you assume that each one of them is already staged in each other's grids, okay, why not enshrine that? Why not create a treaty where you say the superpowers agree to protect each other's grids, have a right to be in each other's grids? I know that's really controversial. This is a thought exercise because they're there anyway, and all we're trying to do is chase each other out or find each other, you know, and take actions. But if superpowers did this, it's not unlike what was done in the nuclear era. Because in the nuclear era, we had the proliferation of weapons. We only got control when we had the ability to inspect each other's facilities. And when we moved to accountability and we moved to transparency, that was completely unimaginable at the time. And by the way, you could do the treaty on grid protection without providing each other the privilege to enter each other's grids and to remain staged there. But I offer that as a thought exercise. But if you had a world where, say, 3 top cyber powers really protected each other's grids and kept the punks out, obviously, if you went to a state of war, then that treaty is going to be invalid. You're going to a state of war and attack each other's grids. But in the meantime, you're keeping the other terrorists, ransomware parties, middle tier and lower tier nations out of that system. So those are two concepts. One is radical decentralization of the grid by simply tweaking the current policy infrastructure, and the second is looking at a global treaty, and that concept could be applied in other areas for confidence building. And I think that we've got to be thinking, and by the way, one of my hats is I'm chair of the Stanford Cybersecurity Policy Program of the advisory board, and that's our group, CSAC at Stanford, came out of the nuclear containment era and using game theory on how to contain the nuclear era. And what I think we have got to do is figure out how do we bring those concepts into the cyber world to get some real traction, because our regular defenses alone are not doing it. Our deterrence mechanisms alone are not doing it.
Before we go to Mr. Giesbergs, you had wanted to chime in.
Just to jump on this last idea of a treaty, I think I agree we should get there. And actually, in the 2015 report of the United Nations governmental group of experts, there is one provision that states should refrain from attacking each other critical energy infrastructure. Now, this is not a treaty. They're voluntary approach. It has been just endorsed by the General Assembly. But I think we should get there. Why we're not getting there? I think there's still a perception of a kind of asymmetry in terms of vulnerability in different countries. I mean, for some, the taking off of the Western Ukrainian grid in December 2015 was also showing the fact that, for example, Soviet-era legacy grid still has manual switches, and this is how actually Ukrainians put the grid back online. And the question is, how many manual switches are like in Western countries? So there's from this point of view, too much automation, too much online.
And by the way, the manual switches are part of the decentralization I'm talking about, because
exactly.
in homes you can switch them off, but you got to have the technology so you don't brown out your electronics in your home. So you got to add some additional technology.
So we need to get a perception of kind of equal vulnerability, not asymmetry in vulnerability. Yeah.
Maybe. I'm not convinced of that.
Though that is what your argument is, to add resilience, but
Yeah.
I'm basically asking, what do you do after the horse is out of the barn?
Well, I know you've asked. Well, I gave my answer. I think that the if you invoke the appropriate articles, then NATO and the allies should engage in helping to defend that country. Now, it's tricky. If it was unintentional, then I don't view it as an act of war, personally. But I'm not going to say that I'm not the legal scholar and the policy expert here. But I'd rather start fixing the problem in the first place. I mean, what I'm proposing is an architectural solution that we can actually implement and do. I don't deny this is a good case study and fascinating, but let's start to fix some of the real problems. And architecture is an issue.
But has anyone defined attacking the grid as an act of war?
Well, it's not automatic. It depends on context. If this generates
but
a
should
blow
it
up,
be made automatic?
if it's a grid that then, I don't know, blows up, it has to do also with the nuclear power plant generation. If it's just, attacking the grid, it's offline for a while, but then it's up again, it's fine. But if this goes into more persistent or disastrous effects, then it is possible.
But again, you're leaving the definition in the hands of the adversary and what they do and the fallout.
Well, no, it's in the hands of those who decide it. In NATO, Article 5 is generated by political decisions by all members in a specific context. This is how it was designed, and this is why the first and only time it was actually invoked was never a scenario that was never envisaged, like 9/11, but it was a disastrous scenario with many deaths, with the strong implications. So I don't think we should take it off the table, but there's no automatic threshold to trigger it.
And, sir,
Yes.
your turn.
No, the next 40 minutes is for me.
That's fair.
Now let's go back to the question. The question is what is going to happen if the grid in Estonia is being attacked and people get killed? It's first of all, I'm a soldier, I'm an operator, I would like to strike back. But I can't because I listen to politicians. And the process, I think, is very simple. Estonia has to ask to invoke Article 5. That's their decision. If they want to do that, I think it would not be needed in this case, because if there is one nation that is resilient, it's Estonia. By the way, the Estonian grid is still connected to the Russian grid, so I think Russia would have more issues with it than Estonia. because Estonia is connected actually with S-Link 1 and 2 to Finland, and they would be able to survive, I think, in this matter. They've done it before. You know, I was here in 2007 to offer Estonia help, but I found out Estonia was much better than NATO at the time. So I don't think anything of that actually would be needed. And by the way, the president of Estonia ran the electricity, part of the electricity company, so she knows what to do anyway. So I'm not so concerned about that. But the problem really in this case is, do we understand what's going on? You know, attribution is an issue. You said it. Is it intentional or not? Where is it coming from? And even if you know where it's coming from, it's still difficult. I remind you, MH17, I'm from the Netherlands. There is hard evidence that the rocket came from Russia. Russia denies, and you know, what's going to happen? It's the international community is not doing too much. 2 nations have now made Russia liable for the activity, Australia and the Netherlands, and it's quite silent. So I'm not sure what's going to, and that was 300 people killed. Yeah. It's 298. So I'm not sure what's going to happen in a situation like that and whether the world is ready to act. If you have this ambiguity of what's really going on.
So let's move to the subject of cyber deterrence and also the weapons you may use to strike back. What are some of the issues that are holding us back from deterring an adversary? Again, it goes back to that feeling that I'm always hearing of reactions rather than someone getting out there in the network and defending from attacks. But of course, maybe the best defense is go unreported.
I would say that cyber deterrence should not be seen as, just singled out. I think deterrence is deterrence, and it should be seen as a multi-domain, cross-spectrum deterrence. That means you don't need to deter cyber attack only through cyber tools like hackback or so on. Many scholars that have proven that there's little utility of cyber tools per se to be used as deterrent, because it's hard to expose them, because you need to show the capability, you need to show the will to engage it and actually communicate it to the adversary. And in cyber case, you might lose the capability if you communicate too much. Although it is said that giving a sense of certain level of cyber power of a country is useful because it has an interesting deterrent. One can deter through many needs, through the spectrum of political, economic sanctions, up to the possibility to respond kinetically. This is why when NATO links cyber defense to collective defense, said in the case of invoking Article 5, in the case of a grave attack, and again, it is going to be linked with human loss and disastrous effects, then there's no implication that the response will be only with cyber means. I think it's also important to go beyond these difficulties of attribution. Yes, there are some intrinsic difficulties, and they should not be underestimated. On the other hand, they should not be overestimated, because we have better capacity for technical analysis, and then at level of states and intergovernmental organizations, you can blend technical analysis with human intelligence, and this way you can get quite accurate attribution. And last but not least, the importance is to have a set of norms, of binding norms, whereby states that do not respect them also know that there's a price to pay for this. So there's a wide area of possible elements that should support such a deterrence, from kinetic to legal, economic, political, and so on.
When I speak to U.S. policymakers about this, their frequent go-to is sanctions. They say, we wouldn't want to respond by tracking down the terminals responsible and burning them up. We would not want to respond with a missile. We'd want to respond with naming, shaming, and then getting a bunch of nations together and implementing sanctions. President Trump just announced essentially a trade war over aluminum against the EU, Mexico, and Canada. So that would kind of throw a wrench in the works, I would think, of unified sanctions over a cyber action by an adversary in a separate occasion. So if not sanctions, then what?
You know, I think in my view, most important is that you maintain ambiguity about your reaction. And that is the position of NATO, that's the position of many. You know, if you don't know what's going to happen in a community that is largely working together, you know, I would love what the president mentioned here, the former president, the cyber NATO, because you need to have a group of like-minded organizations, because the larger that group is, where you get consensus, the larger the effect is of your action. But if you're going to announce what you're going to do in certain circumstances, then it doesn't work. So you need to keep that open and make sure that it is uncertain what the reaction will be. But for me, the concept of resilience is actually not so easy, of deterrence. I think, you know, deterrence by resilience is perhaps the best approach. Making sure that any cyber attack, you know, will not really have too much effect, will basically slow it down. I have some experience with that in defending NATO networks. You know, we saw at certain times quite some opportunities to get our network, especially the website, for example, down. When it was clear that we were well prepared, it stopped. It's because, you know, it basically doesn't make sense to do that. You can defend certain areas, and you need to defend the ones that are most dear to you, that are most important. It's focus there, and then, you know, that will help you, I think, to stop some of the action on the other side.
So you think ambiguity is working for you?
It is.
It's lessening. Is it lessening the number of attacks?
You know, ambiguity from whatever reaction you will give, up to the highest and the most forceful one, will stop activity. But it's not an easy concept, because attribution is the issue. We've seen that. It's the opponent wants to maintain ambiguity as well. And you know, I can come back to the MH17 example, but you know, the world should stand together, and apparently 300 people getting killed is not enough.
Right.
So a couple of things. And first I want to say, I agree with Koen very much on his comment that I think that resilience is one of the best forms of deterrence. And I disagree with him on his comment about the Estonian grid being resilient because it also has Finnish power supply, which is a definite positive. But I would think that if a fellow or a local superpower controls my grid, they probably know how to shut it off without losing their own grid. And they probably know how all the technology, and it works pretty well. But you know, we don't have to dig deeper into that, but I think it's a good discussion. Let's talk a little bit about why deterrence is so difficult. By the way, there have been some excellent presentations here this week on this topic by some of the professors that I really enjoyed and learned a lot from. But why is deterrence difficult? Well, a couple of things. One is I'm going to argue again for thought experiment's sake. In the information, first, espionage is accepted globally by all nation states. And espionage is the acquisition of information by different means, including deception and exfiltration. And cyber is the best platform in human history for espionage, I mean, for data gathering. So that's accepted. And if you take it to the extreme in the information sphere, you can assume that every nation state has 100% visibility into the information of every other major nation state, or at least of every target they choose to go focus on. And I gave a lecture in 2009 at the Foreign Affairs Council in DC, and I was being interviewed by Dan Prieto, and he goes, well, what do you think about the protection of the classified information systems? And I use this as an example. And I said, traditionally we looked at the classified information system as, you know, you had sort of the unclass, and then you had sensitive, and you had secret, and then you had top secret and compartmentalized, et cetera. But you would keep refining the data and putting up bigger barriers and making it harder and harder and harder to get, and like having a bigger safe with more locks and keys. And I said, so, and it made sense. But I said in the cyber era, perhaps what these systems are doing is just concentrating the data for the enemies. and it's at least had to be thought of. And then, of course, when we look at the massive leaks that have occurred from different intelligence organizations around the world, it might give some credence to that. But so the rules in this new information space are just so different than what we've seen. And so, so let's relate it to deterrence. So for one thing, so we're trying to deter, and we're trying to build trust in cyberspace, but the most powerful organizations are in the intelligence community. And part of what you have to do in the intelligence community, and I used to be a senior advisor to the Director of National Intelligence in the US, so I've been involved in different strategic and policy discussions, but part of the goal is to successfully gather data from others. And there's no nations that right now that are offering, say, hey, we'll stop doing information gathering cyber offense, or maybe no major nations that I know of. So in that context, and the nature of the intelligence organizations is not to build trust with each other except your allies. It builds a lot of distrust, because you have to use deception to acquire your information. So you're using an environment of distrust to try to create trust. Now, that's not impossible, by the way. And we did it again in the nuclear era, because it was the intelligence apparatus and the national security establishments that were completely at war with each other that came to the solution. So you can do it. You can evolve collaboration in it, but it makes it a bigger challenge. And then the next challenge is simply the fact that we're all so interdependent on the system. And so let's say one country accidentally takes out part of the grid that they were staging to do something else, and a few people die. And you talk about striking back, and you look at some administrations in some big countries in the world right now that have talked really tough about strike back, and it's hard. It's really hard to say, what are we going to do offensively in cyber that's not going to have worse repercussions for us or spin out of control? Now, we go to sanctions, but sanctions have to be used sparingly. You can't use them all the time, or they lose their effectiveness. And there's corollary effects. So let's say we're going to use trade policy and implement tariffs, which in some ways is just, right? If superpower X is stealing the IP from the other superpowers and using it to fuel their economy and industry, then it would seem that it's fair to put, tariffs on them. But the problem is that the trade war hurts everybody, potentially, and a lot of parties stand up. So it's our interdependence that both creates some great resilience in the system, because we all want the global economy to work. We all want mostly want the global internet to work. But it makes it difficult. So I'm really going to support Kuhn's remark again on resilience.
The other thing is, with sanctions, we've seen North Korea being sanctioned, Russia being sanctioned, Iran being sanctioned for malign activity, but that not stopping any of them from various hacks, cyber attacks. So the question would be, does it just make the policymaker feel good like they're doing something, but doesn't produce a real world deterrence effect?
Go ahead, sorry. Go ahead.
I would say that, frankly, there were so far few sanctions that were response to cyber attacks. I mean, most of them were
I did say
diplomatic,
malign behavior
diplomatic
in general.
sanctions, like, these were, and some are saying that these were perfectly 19th century actions for 21st century attacks. So the positive things, especially in the last year and a half, is first that states came publicly in attributing cyber attacks, which was not so much the case before, and this was mainly after WannaCry, NotPetya. And with this kind of diplomatic sanction, I think there are many more options on the table that could be in the economic domain, like I think it was President Ilves that said, what about cutting off of the SWIFT systems of financial payments that would really cripple an economy and so on. And I think the fact that there is a will to respond with really biting cost implying measures, that's the only thing that would make really attackers not act with impunity. But we are just at the beginning of it. We started with what is called strong public and political attribution. Next step would be, okay, what to do about this after doing this attribution.
Yes, and meanwhile, I'd like to ask folks to start thinking about questions, to red team some of their ideas up here. Rod.
Yeah, I think I might be almost as big a fan of Clausewitz, the Prussian military strategist, as former President Thomas Ilves, who's quoted him at least 2 or 3 times this week. But most of us are familiar with Clausewitz's most famous quote that war is policy by other means. And what I say is that policy is just a reflection of sociology and culture and power struggle issues. And what that means in the cyber context and the cyber wars we're talking about here in deterrence and in taking down grids is what's happening in the internet. I view the internet as like the greatest mirror ever in human history on the human psyche. I mean, down to the level of individuals and what they click on and think or talk about. And all of our psychoses or fears, all of our strengths, all the light, all the darkness, everything comes out. And what we see in the manipulation of the campaign, for example, of election campaigns, is people seeking to stoke fears and stoke traumas and to get people to have emotional and psychological responses. And then, in fact, if you look at the use of artificial intelligence or machine learning on the internet, probably the richest vein of development and use today is on how to get human beings to click on something and buy it. Okay, the whole kind of Google AdWords thing and all the online advertising. But enormous amounts of investments are made to change the human behavior. Click on this, click on that. And what we're not doing in international relations, if you look at it, like you look at the 2007 struggle here in Estonia, right? I understand it occurred because a Soviet statue was being moved from the city to a cemetery. Okay, and that was a cultural affront to one group and a celebration of victory for another. And that sociological issue and divide, instead of going to fighting in the streets, I think, it's probably fortunate it went to cyberspace and affected banking systems and government systems. That's better than people's blood being spilled, which certainly could have happened. And probably was much less worse than it would have been if the statue was being destroyed rather than moved. But that's just a case study of how sociology drives cyber wars. And I think most of what we see going on in cyber wars around the world is really driven by sociology. We need to understand that, and particularly when it comes to deterrence. So I'll do a really quick, bigger case study. An Asian superpower hacking the SF686 database that many of us were in the American intelligence community. And
reporters who were covering the White House
Right.
got hacked.
Yeah.
As part of that.
Yeah, it quite a number of parties. But one of the responses was naming and shaming, right? And I remember the celebrations in D.C. when the criminal charges were put up against a number of generals from this country, and their names were put up, and their pictures were put up, and there was a lot of attaboys going on in D.C. and elsewhere. And a lot of my friends, in the system were pretty happy and like, wow, we're finally doing something. We're holding somebody accountable. Isn't it great? And I thought, well, hey, maybe this is going to work. And from the American political standpoint, it did work because we thought like, hey, we've done something. And then I was in China 9 months later at the World Internet Conference and happened to be talking to different Chinese leaders. And I said, so how'd you guys feel about this action? And the social and psychological response in China was nothing I would ever anticipated. They were furious beyond belief. They thought it was so disgraceful, it was unbelievable. Well, for one thing, think about the fact that if they might have gathered millions of records of incredibly sensitive information on individuals in the US government, and then they're supposed to get intimidated by 14 photos being put out there of their generals and leaders. So first, think about that, okay? Game theory, what's your strategy here? But in their culture, that was the most insulting thing anyone could ever do. And their view was, we have to get more aggressive in our cyber efforts. That this is so disgraceful, it's so unbelievable that our leaders would be named and shamed. We could, of course, do the same thing and worse, and we never would. And we are so furious, perhaps we should take kinetic action. So, and what I'm bringing in here is the dimension of, ultimately in deterrence, if we want to deter actions and behaviors by the other party, we need to understand their mindset. So if you look at the election operations by other countries in the US and Mexico and different places, obviously they're trying to figure out how to change the psychology in these other countries and create FUD, by the way, as much as anything else, and have a lot of fun and get in the news. But which is a sociological thing. If I look at Russia, Russia is a declining power. Tremendously declining power. And they lost the Soviet Union, which is an incredible sense of loss for them, because that was one of the greatest powers on earth. Suffering a traumatic loss of global stature and pride, they're seeking relevance. what better platform is there than cyber to have some relevance in the news today? And has it put them there? I think it has. So anyway, so I think the sociological dimension and psychological dimensions are something we should think about in deterrence more actively. Secondly, we should be using the artificial intelligence and machine learning to better understand how do we heal nations from traumas, including our own.
But if you look at the concept of resilience, so we said deterrence by resilience, there is of course a huge issue, and the issue is that in the Western world we are stovepiped. Nobody works together, and actually we foster that. We want the government to compete with industry, and you need to, the distance between industry and government is actually growing as opposed to getting smaller. In the cyber domain, those opponents that we see, they all work together because they get it from the top, and the state capitalism in China is a good example. Today, 9 out of the 20 top internet companies in the world are Chinese. It's 5 years ago, it was 3. And this will increase rather rapidly, and I can tell you, in my view, in 5 years, they will be on the top of that list. And that is because they use state means, the stealing of intellectual property, for example, and then they exploit it in a very smart way, which fits in their culture, not in ours. So I'm not saying that it is, from their perspective, that is the way to how things work. Our perspective is different. And I think one of the most important things we need to do to get more resilience is to let those different organizations, industry, government, academia, find better ways to work together, remove the boundaries, because our opponents, they use the boundaries. That is a typical military thing that you've seen everywhere. You get the enemy on their weakest spot, and that's on the boundary between 2 units. That's the same in the internet. So I think that collaboration needs to be improved, and Luke actually in his former presentation said it as well, through exercises. I'm doing exercises with governments, and you see that nobody is working together. So we make that clear to them in those exercises. Actually, they find it out and they start improving it. But if we don't do something really radical about, the collaboration with the different entities in our Western world, we will lose the war.
With that, I'd like to invite questions, and I'd also like to ask, please make sure there's a question in your question. The lady in the second row right here, if we could get a microphone to her, making the volunteers hop across the room. And if you could stand up and introduce yourself as well. Of course.
Good morning, gentlemen, ma'am. Thank you for this panel. I think it's been a great discussion. My name is Annie Oakley. I'm from the United States Naval Academy. My question is specifically for you, Mr. Beckstrom, but I would appreciate a response from everyone. I'm specifically curious why you believe so strongly that a proportional response to a cyber attack should be based off of the intentions of the attacking country, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I believe intentions can be easily lied about by an attacking country. And also in a kinetic attack, I mean, as a soldier, if I'm a pilot and I go out with the intention to bomb a factory or a bombing factory, but I bomb a hospital instead, it doesn't matter what my intentions were, it matters the outcome. So I'm curious why you believe that should be different in a cyber attack and our response to that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a judgment call. I mean, if you have a wreck on the highway and someone's, made a mistake but not violated a law, but they missed looking at something and people are killed, that's different than if they intended to hit another car, or were drunk, or took some malicious action, or were in a state. So, and this is by way of analogy. And I think, as Soren mentioned, in the NATO, my understanding is the NATO context, it's a political decision to decide whether something's an act of war. So I'm not going to say, I think it's a great question you're asking, and it's why we need smart young people like you thinking through these issues. But these boundaries are kind of like especially in cyberspace. It's like there's no fixed boundaries. I mean, there's no clear boundary between offense and defense. There's no clear boundary sometimes between a white hat, a gray hat, and a black hat. So I think the intentionality thing is probably something that will be factored into the political process, but just morally, I guess I was responding more at a moral level. I feel that it's the intention of something that, if you intended to kill people and you killed people, you're definitely guilty of killing the people. If you weren't trying to kill them, but you participated in something that led to them dying, doesn't seem quite the same to me. But I'm not going to say that I'm either the ethical or legal expert to draw the finest lines. Thank you.
But then that also goes to who's making the case, who's building the evidence, and what are the powers, authorities, and responsibilities of whoever builds that case. Do they bring it to the UN? Do they bring it to an international court? Doesn't seem that that has been decided in the cyber world.
And it also has to do with the way the potential or suspected actor who generated this attack behaves. I mean, if you can see like goodwill behavior, yes, it was unintentional, it was collateral damage, say, then there are actions that you can show, you can respond. Of course, there are things that you cannot bring back to life, but it has to do with attitude. And this doesn't mean that if the attacker say, well, I have not done it, that you take it his word. There are ways to check in what the intentions are. That's why I'm saying context is important, intelligence it's important, and this will base the decision that is taken. And it's always on a case-by-case basis, and it's a political decision.
Kern, did you have anything to add? Nope.
No, it's clear that if a nation state admits that this happened unintentionally, then it's easy. But unfortunately, some nation states find that difficult to do, even if it is a mistake. It's and I'm not only looking at Russia.
A la Stuxnet.
There are other examples even in the Western world where something happened that we didn't really wanted to admit.
Next question. Let's see. The person 4N right in the middle there.
Hello, I'm Cadet Lloyd Bill from United States Military Academy at West Point, and basically what we talked about was how to respond to cyber attacks from another state. I guess my question is, and it kind of goes along with that question, how exactly do we go about measuring a proportional response in order to prepare for like a counterattack from a different state or a cyber attack from a different state?
Again, one of those concrete questions. How do you measure for a proportionate response?
It is really difficult. It's because it has to do with the clear understanding what happened, and we know that in cyberspace, getting a clear understanding what happened is not so easy. It might take even quite some time before you're there. It's of course it's different. It's different when it happens during a military operation. Then it's an integral element of what happened in that operation. And I think we're really pretty well prepared for that. But in cyberspace itself, I think what we have seen is that if we have this will most likely lead to political reactions and clear. Using organizations like the United Nations, but NATO and others. So it's really difficult. We're struggling with it. I would suggest read Talon Manual 2. That will help.
So putting on your NATO or your DNI hat, say the Chinese had stolen 1 million record files, would you recommend, well, let's steal back? If you were behind closed doors, and then let them know that we have it, and how would you let them know? Would you leak it to the New York Times?
Sure. I mean, in terms of a process response, I like the Talon Manual 2 suggestion, which is excellent, and it's a really good question. And we don't have the clear answer to these things, and we don't have the clear lines drawn in the sand, and we're trying to draw more of them. It's pretty hard. We don't have that many good cyber norms and definitions out there because of definition problems and boundary problems. In the end, it ends up typically, as Soren said, ended up being a political process. I mean, in the case of the White House, at the highest level, this goes up to the Situation Room and different thinkers of saying how are we going to respond to this thing. And getting back to the SF-86 one, which is a really tragic loss for the U.S. If you get
Does
back
everyone
to,
know what an SF-86 is? It's the form, the dozens of pages long form you have to fill out with your whole life story, your financial picture to get a position in government.
Yeah.
Or to get a press credential to access a classified building like the Pentagon.
And by the way, one thing I would say is I hope the people that stole that are protecting it well so it doesn't get stolen by too many other parties from them. By the way, secondary leakage is a serious problem. But if you get back to my kind of general theory of everything's vulnerable, and in the information sphere, most precious information, it's actually an interesting question. This would be a great research question for the young, smart people in the room: is what is the average diffusion time to classified information? Not the legal diffusion time, but the effective diffusion time. In the same way, in the vulnerability space, there's a discussion about what's the average life of a 0 day. Until it's discovered. And by the way, I've heard anything from 2 months to 263 days. I don't know where the answer is, but that's the view is that the median 0 days in there. So, but it's an interesting theoretical question, not theoretical question, actually empirical as well. In our classified systems and in our societies, what is the half-life of classified information? Until it leaks or gets disclosed or publicized or gets stolen. And in general, I think it was Stuart Wells, I'm not sure, the kind of philosopher who came up with the quote, "Information wants to be free." And it has two meanings, both free economically and free out there in the wild. And clearly, this massive, open, integrated system that we've created tends to push things in that direction. But so, in light of that, it's not for me. I neither have the knowledge nor would I want to comment upon, who has what information. Well, let's just say there's a lot of information sharing going on out there.
And I have to say, as a reporter who doesn't have to pay attention to what's classified or not, but by the way, when I meant access to classified buildings, I meant sensitive buildings. I legally can't see classified information, but it regularly would get leaked to me. And I've also had people like Anonymous send me things, and I've chosen not to run them because I can't determine what's fact and what's fiction, and I can't determine, as a reporter sitting down with a source, you always try to figure out, why are they sharing this with me? And since I don't know who exactly this person is who's sharing these massive data files with me, I don't know their intent, and I don't want to be used as a tool.
But I think it's really important. It's a really important question because it is unclear. We don't know the rules, and it's really up to states to behave properly and create actually jurisprudence on those rules. And my nation is actually trying to get some boundaries there. I can give some examples. The Bredo Lab case, you can look it up at the internet. There was a huge botnet that was found by our intelligence service or police. We actually took it over. And we could take it over because it was hosted in the Netherlands. So we couldn't do that outside of the boundaries of our nation. But of course, the botnet itself was all over the world. So we basically took it over, and the guy fought back. This was a little bit of war on the internet, on Dutch soil. The guy who did that actually was from Belarus. Actually, he was from Armenia, but his operations center was in Belarus. But the servers were in the Netherlands, and therefore we could fight back and we could take it over. And actually, this basically creates clarity of what a nation state can or cannot do in a certain event. There are more cases. The Hansa has been clear. The US has taken down Hansa. In the dark web, there was another web store, of illegal stuff that was actually ran by our Dutch police department for almost 4 months, because we didn't shut it down, we operated it. And that is open information. We operated it, we collected all the data of all the people that used that store, and they're now actually being prosecuted. I think it is important that we find the ways to deal with those issues, and it's really nation states that have to take their responsibility and then be open about it, so that we understand what this means and what we can and cannot do.
Yeah. Soren, and then.
Yeah. I also think it's a relevant question. It is indeed extremely difficult to measure the proportionate response and its effects. This is why theory of escalation dynamics related to cyber operations is really very difficult. Somebody said that we are in the infancy of the digital era, and it will take some time to really go into conceptual thinking and apply some of the concepts that are in the other domain. I'm afraid that the technological development will continue to be so fast that there will be new and new elements, artificial intelligence and so on, that will make this continuously difficult. That's why I think we need to focus also on what is means closing the cognitive gap, the knowledge gap between what the technical implications are of this technology into the language of strategy and policy.
Rod.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Kun was saying. I was thinking about, in terms of hijacking botnet hordes, and what that's about is that most botnet zombie machines out there there's a command and control center. The hacker or someone is controlling that, and if you could subvert that and take over control, then you control that same botnet group and can use it for good, and you can certainly neutralize them. And that is one form of striking back that I think it's pretty much accepted, globally, that is acceptable striking back, is to take over any bot that's coming after you. And I haven't looked at it recently, but most of that's moved to the cloud now. I mean, and spun up in AWS and different environments, so it's even faster moving space. And I was laughing just because one of my favorite friends, one of my favorite good hackers in the world, is one of the best guys at doing that.
Well, in the interest of ending on time, because one of our panelists is rushing straight to the airport, I want to thank CyCon, the Estonian government, as CNN Global Affairs analyst and former editor of the Cipher Brief, and our panelists for a fantastic conversation. And so if you didn't hear the answers that you expected, find the two of them that are staying during the coffee hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you.